I'm Robin Scott at Oklahoma State University, Oklahoma City. We're going to be able to listen to Jason Stone, who is Department Head of Humanities here at OSU-OKC, talk about one of the things that he really excels at, and that is teaching with visual aids. These days, our students have all kinds of really bombardments with visual aids. They see all kinds of visuals on television, they see visuals on the internet, and we have to learn how to teach like that in order to engage our students, in order for them to learn and progress and be able to absorb the material. They need visuals. So again, we are so glad to have Jason Stone giving you all kinds of ideas how to engage your students with visual aids.
Greetings, Encore Grant participants. If you have decided to teach in college, it is a little bit different than it was when you went there. The most pronounced difference, in my opinion, is that the college has moved remarkably from an auditory sort of format to being a visual-dominated medium. For the most part, your classes that you will be teaching need to have visual components. Instructors who fail to integrate visual components are routinely rated less highly than those who do, typically have to deal with more attitudinal problems in class, and oftentimes have students who fail to retain as much information as their counterparts who use visually intense sort of methodologies with regard to teaching their materials. So today we're going to talk about using visual aids, and I have some different graphics that I wanted to share with you. We have a couple of different things here. This is of course a slide that I made. I harvested most of these images from the World Wide Web. In the top left-hand corner we have a picture of a local hotel. In the top right-hand corner we have a graphic of an asteroid striking the Earth, and in the bottom left-hand corner we have a young lady who's dressed in Mardi Gras regalia. In the bottom right-hand corner we have an example of a visual aid that I constructed, pulling together a bunch of different elements and integrating those in PowerPoint. We of course have a young woman who is demonstrating sort of to scale the different proximities that are demonstrated by social research, and Edward T. Hall in his groundbreaking book, The Hidden Dimension, that discusses proximity. So those are some examples of some visual aids that you might find yourself using in a class. I think that your ability to communicate well with your students using evocative visual images will go a long ways towards your maturation as an instructor, and I would highly encourage you to use those as much as possible. So let's look at some of the things specifically that I'd like to share with you with regard to the construction of visual aids and good visual communication. There are a number of reasons why it's important to use a good visual aid. First and foremost, it focuses the audience's attention off of you. If you're one of these communication-averse sort of individuals and you feel like it's challenging for you to be focused on that intensely by an audience, it gives the audience something else to look at. The second reason is that it helps visual learners absorb information. There's a lot of educational research that's being conducted right now, and it says that overwhelmingly our pedagogy is moving from an auditory-based sort of learning style to a visually-based learning style. And if you think about the young people that you would have an opportunity to interact with in a classroom today, they are saturated by visual imagery. And the saturation is really reaching a point of kind of epic proportions. They visually communicate with individuals on Facebook. They visually absorb new information on sites such as YouTube. And it's estimated that they will see tens of thousands of visual images, most of which are computer mediated over the course of a week. So based on that, it's very important for you to communicate with them as visually as possible if you want to maintain their attention. Which leads us to the third point in that bullet, and that is that it helps get the audience's attention. It also assists the speaker at attempts at humor. Obviously, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it's much easier to be humorous with a picture than it is necessarily by using communication and by using words. It maintains the speaker's credibility, and finally, it demonstrates preparation and respect for the audience. And as I teach public speaking here at OSU-OKC, this is one of the points that I belabor quite often, and that is that it demonstrates preparation and respect for your audience. If you have a presentation that you've obviously put a lot of time into and that you've prepared well in advance, and that there are a number of visual intricacies within the presentation, it communicates to the audience exactly how important that opportunity to discuss that material with them was to you, because you took the opportunity to get prepared. Next, we learn a little bit about visual communication in terms of how we learn. And this slide specifically says that sight makes up around 75% of what we process, as opposed to 13%, which is the next highest category in terms of hearing. And that leads us to a very profound conclusion, and that is that the overwhelming majority of what we process, the overwhelming majority of how we learn is through sight. We tend to believe and we tend to learn whatever it is that we see. So as a result of that, it's very, very important for you to communicate with audiences, and in particular to communicate with your students using visual methods. And you notice there that the other ones, touch, smell, and taste, basically account for around 12% of how we learn. So 3/4, overwhelming majority of what we learn, we believe because we have seen. Next, I'd like to talk to you about visual aids and long-term recall. And I think that this study is really, really interesting. A technology trainer went into a group of Nebraska primary school teachers, and they delivered the same presentation about the same topic using 3 different presentation styles. The first presentation style involved primarily telling those teachers the information that they wanted them to retain. The second presentation style involved exclusively showing them without the use of any auditory communication, so only flashing a PowerPoint with text and with images. The third communication style and the third group was essentially our experimental group, and that was the group that received both a combination of showing and telling. And what's very interesting about that graphic is that they did a little bit of a recall test, and they asked them about the presentation that they had seen 3 hours, and then at the conclusion of the conference, 3 days after they had received that information. What they found was that the people who had just been told, the people who had just processed using auditory methods, remembered after 3 hours approximately 70% of the information. The people who had just been shown after 3 hours remembered roughly the same, a little bit more. The people who had been both shown and told had about a 12% bump from both of those, and were in right at around 80% in terms of recall. However, the people after 3 days, you see, the kind of the drop there, and that's demonstrated by the red pyramid in the graphic that I'm showing you now. And that is that the people who were just told had roughly around a 7 or 8% recall after 3 days. The people who had been shown things, because visual processing kind of predominates, had more of a recall, and that was somewhere at around 20%. However, after 3 days, the people who had been both shown and told had a recall there of somewhere around 60%, a little bit higher than 60%. So this is obviously great clinical, valid, reliable data that shows us that if you want to dramatically increase what your students remember, you need to both show and tell in order to facilitate effective recall. Now, some limitations with regard to that finding. It was a sample primarily of high school instructors, It wasn't necessarily students. I would hypothesize that those results would be even more pronounced in college-stage students because they are so remarkably visual. So the days really, I think, of just sort of, the sage on the stage and kind of just lecturing are really rapidly coming to a conclusion in the collegiate sort of environment. And if you are going to be the sage on the stage and just lecture, you better make sure that you've got a great PowerPoint deck in addition to some really, really good stories. So some tips for using visual aids, and we're going to discuss each of these in a little bit of detail, and I'll go ahead and make sure that you can see them there as well. Avoid using the dry erase board for a visual aid. Prepare your visual aids well in advance. Make sure that your visual aids are large enough and clear enough. Display those visual aids where the listeners can see them. Avoid passing a visual aid out among the audience. Display the visual aid only while you are discussing it and then minimize it or make it go away whenever you're not talking about it. Talk to your audience and not your visual aid, and explain the visual aid clearly and concisely. Finally, practice with your visual aid because as we will learn, Murphy's Law applies to visual aids, and anything that can go wrong probably will go wrong. All of those are adapted from the Lucas textbook, which is The Art of Public Speaking. Let's talk about each of those in a little bit of detail. This first slide with regard to avoid using the dry erase board for a visual aid. These are some of my recommendations with regard to it. You're not a professional artist. This typically consumes way too much time. Your poor penmanship is going to detract from your credibility, and the potential for misspelling is going to increase your anxiety. And I can tell you from personal experience, the last thing that you want to experience in front of a classroom full of students is anxiety. And if you have a propensity to use spell check a lot when you're constructing a Word document, if you misspell those things, it will certainly decrease your credibility. I can tell you from experience, please don't make that mistake and learn about it the hard way as I did. So I have a couple of kind of, I think, interesting visuals to help prove this point. And the first one here is something that I wrote on a white dry erase board. And as you can tell from that, I am not going to win any calligraphy contests anytime soon. One of the happiest moments in my life was in 6th grade when we stopped having penmanship grades because I would always make very high marks on everything else except for penmanship. And a quote that I have for you: if you've ever misspelled something in Christmas lights, which is of course a Jeff Foxworthy joke, you might be a redneck. If you've done it while using a whiteboard, then you probably should have used PowerPoint. And that would be one of my big recommendations to you as a prospective instructor, and that is master PowerPoint. Understand how it works, begin to seek it out. There are some amazing tutorials for how to use all different versions of PowerPoint, all the way from 97 up to the latest version 2010, available on Microsoft.com. And those are, of course, animated training videos that will help you greatly in your use of PowerPoint. And there, of course, we have something misspelled in Christmas lights. You would not want to have something egregious like that displayed on the rooftop of your home, and you certainly wouldn't want to do something like that in front of a group of students. In addition to that, stick figures don't really demonstrate any artistic ability. Only use the markers to explain things on the fly. Impromptu explanations, it's okay to use the markers. Otherwise, you're much better off finding and harvesting an image that more appropriately demonstrates whatever it is that you want to talk about. And some places that I go to look for images on a World Wide Web Internet Explorer browser, I just click on Images right next to the Web button, and that helps me find exclusively images that I could use. I also go to MicrosoftClipArts.com. It's another place that I go to harvest images. I also find a lot of images available for use in presentations on Flickr.com. And Flickr.com is a photo sharing website where amateur and professional photographers upload images. Some of those images have been donated to the Creative Commons. In other words, if you want to use the image for some type of a creative purpose, for some type of an educational purpose, it's free for you to use. You can also purchase images, although I highly recommend against this, at iStock.com. And those images will cost you anywhere from $5 to $50 depending on the resolution and depending on the uniqueness of those particular images. Another thing that I would recommend is is if you spend longer than 15 minutes looking for a photo online, get your digital camera out and construct the photo yourself. That's going to help you visually communicate. It's also going to help you to personalize the lecture and to personalize whatever it is that you're discussing with your students, and I highly recommend that. So that's our first recommendation, and that is to avoid using the dry erase board for your visual aid. My second recommendation would be to prepare your visual aid well in advance. And here we have a graphic of a woman who is thinking about speaking to a large group of people. Hopefully you will not be speaking to a classroom of that size, but you never know. Your career in education might take you to such heights. I would recommend that you prepare that visual aid well in advance so that you understand where it is that you're going to be presenting it and what some potential problems that you might have with the visual aid might be. This next point that I'd like to make with you is very important, and that is make sure that your visual aids are large enough and clear enough to be seen at all different points within the classroom. And I think a lot of people have a propensity, especially when they're making bullets in PowerPoint, to use too small a font. For instance, the font that I'm displaying on your screen right now is a 12-point font. And the text that I have there may be a little challenging for some of you to read at this point, and that's sort of the idea. As opposed to that font, which is a 24-point font, that's obviously a lot easier to read. In a larger classroom, a 24-point font can be seen by most people if there is a large enough display screen. However, obviously the 26 or the 36-point font is obviously much better, and that's going to be a lot easier for people to see. The next point that I'd like to make with regard to visual communication involves contrast, and that is you've got to have some good contrast. If you have a white background, make sure that you're using black text. If you have a black background, make sure that you're using white text. I had an opportunity to watch a presentation not too long ago, and it was actually a presentation that was done by kind of a higher up at a sister institution, and the background of the PowerPoint slide really sort of replicated something that I'm going to show to you here in just a moment, and it's a great example of how a failure to use contrast really limits your audience's ability to understand your presentation. And in addition to that failure to use contrast, we also have kind of some font sizing issues that we'll also explore in this next slide. So there's a background very similar to the one that I saw in the presentation. You may or may not have noticed it, but I just dropped in a 12-point gray font sort of line of text there, and it's almost completely indiscernible up at the top of the screen there by the top orange ellipse. The second one that I just dropped in is a little bit bigger, but it still uses that gray font. And then finally, with up to a 32-point font, you're starting to sort of see it, and there's a little bit of a contrast between the gray and the black, and it's kind of getting easier to see. With the 44-point font, you can see it in some areas, but not in other areas of the slide because you've got contrast issues. And then finally, with the black there, it completely is absorbed by the black background. You can sort of see it on the gray. It pops very nicely on the orange, but you have a lot of problems reading it, as opposed to the 40-point white font on that particular background. The entirety of this educational administrator's presentation was in that gray font, and it was almost impossible to see any of the slides that were being projected. Needless to say, many of us left questioning that person's speaking ability, also questioning that person's ability to construct visual aids. And of course, being able to visually communicate is so important in education and so important to your future as a good educator. So I would highly encourage you to not make the same mistakes that educator made. The next one that I would like to talk to you about are different types of fonts. And the overwhelming majority of instructional design research and the overwhelming majority of graphic design research says that on a computer screen, Arial font is the easiest one to see. There are a number of fonts that you want to avoid, but I would encourage you to use Arial as much as possible. The font there to the left is a great example of how a cursive sort of font is very challenging to read on a computer screen. So I would encourage you to avoid those things, and I would encourage you instead rather to communicate with an Arial font, because a good visual aid should be easy to read, it should be written in a clear font, it should communicate a main point, It isn't written in a full sentence. It guides the listener in, and it invites the eye of the listener or the reader in with white space. And to illustrate this point, look at the block of text. Essentially, we have the same message being communicated with those two blocks of text. One is written out longhand and is just an example of an instructor taking a set of notes and kind of just turning them into a PowerPoint with a very unreadable font. The other one is obviously an attempt to bullet point things out and to communicate visually. So make things concise, make them smaller, invite the reader in with the use of white space, invite them to start looking at a particular area with a bullet point, and your PowerPoints will be better. The next slide that I'd like to share with you is color. And I would encourage you to use very colorful, evocative images in your PowerPoint, but I would discourage you from using color too much in your fonts. And I think that that's a mistake that a lot of people who are beginning to play with PowerPoint make, is they want to use all these different colored fonts and they want, to have a lot of contrast on a white background, not by using a black or, a very dark blue readable font, but instead by interjecting a lot of color into their presentation. And I have a couple of examples for you here on this next slide. And I think that you can sort of see how it begins to kind of degenerate into something that doesn't really look professional. The more word arty it is, the more bright and popping the colors are, the less professional it looks, as opposed to what we have there on the right-hand side of the screen, which is an Arial font that is about a 30-point font. It's plenty large enough to see, and it looks very professional. So I would caution you against that, and make sure that you learn those lessons there about large and clear enough. The next one is very easy, and I don't really have a whole lot of slides to demonstrate that, but it is display the slides, display the visual aid where the listener can see them. Obviously, if I've got a visual aid and it's up here and I'm not using a document camera and I just sort of am holding it in my hands, it's going to be very challenging for the individuals in the audience to see what exactly it is that I'm trying to share with them. So I would encourage you to make sure that they can see them. The next point is a very important one, and I think that a lot of young instructors tend to make this mistake, and that is avoid passing the visual aid out in the audience. You are talking about the visual aid at a specific point in time in your lecture. If you have a big stack of photos, if you were to pass that big stack of photos around, it's not going to go around as one big stack of photos and then everyone's going to look at the whole stack of photos and then pass the whole stack of photos on to the next person. They're going to look at one and then they're going to pass it on down the line. And it's going to be kind of a serpentine sort of arrangement. Reminds me of an interesting speech that I recently heard by a student who did not use PowerPoint and instead decided to pass out that visual aid to the audience. And this student had an opportunity to take a really interesting trip. They went to Australia. They swam with the sharks in the Great Barrier Reef. They camped next to the 8th most venomous spider in the world. They saw the Sydney Opera House, and they went scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef. So they had a trip of a lifetime. It was really an amazing trip, and the photographs from that trip were incredibly fun to look at and to evaluate. Unfortunately, I did not get to see the photographs while the speaker was speaking. In fact, the photographs didn't snake their way around to me for me to look at until about 3 speeches later. So you may have a point that you're attempting to make with a photograph, with an image, with some type of a visual aid. If you just pass that out and allow it to snake around, it's not going to get there until well after you've already made that point. So here's a diagram of a typical classroom. If the instructor goes and starts to pass something out right there, see how it begins to snake around? And of course, I've already moved on, and now I'm done talking about that facet of student success, and now I'm talking about something completely different. So avoid that. Try to display things. In addition to that, it's going to be a lot cheaper. You have more possibility of actually having your artifacts returned to you. All of those things are just more sound pedagogy. The next one that I'd like to talk to you about is to display the visual aid only while you are discussing it. So if I was to not talk about the visual aid, I would just simply click on the button down here and make the visual aid go away. And that's a really good example of displaying the visual aid only while you're discussing it. There's a couple of different ways that you can do that. First, you can use a black slide to focus attention, and you can just insert a basic shape. You can pause the video there to sort of see what those steps are. If you're using PowerPoint 2003, there's an example of some different screen grabs. If you're still struggling with that, please email me and I'd be happy to talk you through that process over the phone. What you want, though, is to insert a black slide very similar to that one if you have a point in the presentation where you're not going to be talking about something. You can also accomplish this simply by hitting the Shift and B button. The Shift and the B button makes the PowerPoint slide essentially go black or go away, and that's a great way to minimize your PowerPoint slide while you're not talking about it. A couple of more here. First, or I guess next rather, is talk to your audience and not your visual aid. Talk to your audience and not your visual aid. And here's an example of a speaker who has turned their shoulders more than 45 degrees, and they are exclusively sort of looking at the visual aid. Also an example of a speaker who has decided to turn all the way around and to look at the visual aid. So I am very compelling like that. Not so much. I am also not very compelling when I'm looking over here at the visual aid and kind of glancing at that. You'll want to make sure that your instructor station displays the visual aid so that you can see what it is that you are talking about. You may need to turn a monitor, you may need to turn a laptop so that you can see that, so that you will be talking indeed to your audience and not talking to your visual aid or talking to your visual aid. If you do need to turn your head to discuss something that's being projected up on the board, it's a good idea to make sure that your shoulders stay mostly parallel to the audience. You don't want to turn your shoulders at greater than a 45-degree angle. If you turn your shoulders at greater than a 45-degree angle and then in combination turn your head, you're no longer looking at the audience. And that break in eye contact is going to cause the audience to begin to drift and to think about something else. So all of those things are great recommendations for using visual aids. Finally, explain the VA clearly and concisely. Another good example for you here. We have a professor. And that's really what he sounds like. He sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher. He is saying, thus, after squaring the applicable prime numbers, we are ready to divide the number of participants in the experimental group. The quotient should be similar to our original hypothesis. You want to explain your visual aid clearly and concisely. Reminds me of a speech that I recently heard. A young woman who was on the golf team at UCO gave a great speech about how to read a putting green. And she had great examples. She had different maps, topographic maps that talked about different ways that greens lie, and about the GPS mapping technology that they're now using to sort of tell you topographically what a putting green looks like. She did a great job explaining that. And, as you might well imagine, an NCAA athlete who's on scholarship, who's played 4 years of this sport in high school and started swinging clubs when she was 6 or 7 years old, probably has a wealth of expertise to share about that particular topic. She was limited to about 8 minutes. She probably could have talked about that topic for about 8 hours if I would have let her. She didn't need that much time to discuss it, though, because she did a great job explaining the visual aids clearly and concisely. She had written out in advance exactly what she wanted to talk about when it came to each one of the particular visual aids that she was discussing. If you do have a tendency to be a little bit more verbose and to ramble a little bit when you're talking about a picture, you may want to do the same. You might want to write out very clearly and concisely exactly what it is that you want to share about that particular visual aid as you're discussing it. What she did was write all of that stuff down on a note card. And I would recommend that you do something like that, or that you have a set of speaking notes, and you might even put, in parentheses out to the side, now, discuss the top left, visual aid. This is what you're going to say about it. Finally, our last recommendation for using visual aids is to practice with your visual aid. You can count on things going wrong in public speaking situations and in teaching situations, and it brings us back to that graphic of the young woman looking out at the audience. She is visualizing how she is going to use those visual aids, and she's arrived there well in advance to make sure that she understands how the audio visual aids will work in the room and how they will be projected. So understand that college and that the collegiate environment is probably a little bit different than it was whenever you went to school there. Professors do talk, but because college is typically sort of a reflection of the larger society, and the larger society has become remarkably more visual in nature, the collegiate learning environment reflects that. And if you want to be an excellent instructor, you need to begin to understand the ways of PowerPoint and begin to understand visual literacy and begin to understand how you will animate material for students using visual aids. Research into student attention spans say that they have shrank from an all-time high in the 1860s of around 3 hours and 30 minutes down to an all-time low as recently as last year of 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So 2 minutes and 30 seconds or so goes by, you need to have a new visual aid, you need to have a new story, you need to use some proximity, you need to move around, you need to do something to stimulate your learner's attention. If you fail to stimulate that learner's attention, as we saw from the pyramid graph at the beginning of the discussion, their ability to recall information will be decreased and it will go down, and you will not be as effective imparting the very important life lessons that you want to share with them. I hope that you learned something from our brief discussion of visual aids. I'm always available to instructors who require help with regard to that process. It can be very time consumptive to produce good visual aids. You can also, however, communicate something very succinctly and very clearly with very little confusion by learning how to master the art of producing great visual aids. Thank you.